Garfield is a very fat orange cat known all over the world for loving lasagna and detesting Mondays, and in recent years for attracting a lot of rather ghoulish reinterpretations. But something you may not have known is that Garfield's official history is also full of weird stuff. For example, one of the most well-known cases is that of Lyman, a character who was introduced way back in 1978, introducing himself as a friend of John's and bringing his dog Odie into the house while they stayed for a while, giving the dog his origin. The problem is that Lyman received a rather dark fate. Lyman officially disappears from the comics in 183, leaving a huge mystery for Garfield fans, as Odie would pop up all the time, but there was no reference to his original owner. Until one of the many days when he was asked what happened to Lyman, Jim Davis only replied, "Don't look in John's basement." But of course this was a joke, wasn't it? This image comes from Garfield's Scary Scavenger Hunt. See, a rather quiet little Halloween game which in the midst of making you search for things inside a haunted mansion shows us Lyman locked under a basement, begging for food around human remains. Of course in any other series this would be considered a joke for the time, but taking into account the above statements, knowing that Jim Davis remained quite inrigious when asked about it, and that the last time his face appeared was in a newspaper without context some 10 years ago, in 2013, we seem to suggest that this was the end of the character. And with this macabre introduction, we give way to our strange journey into one of the darkest corners of the Garfield franchise, which could start with a lengthy investigation or a collection of strange facts. But just for today, it will be straightforward. Garfield is dead. And that's not all. Garfield has died several times, in ways so twisted and heinous that I'm surprised you haven't been told. And if you know Garfield, I'm sure there's one you already have in mind, which we'll discuss in a moment. That Halloween comic where it's revealed that Garfield is actually in a house slowly starving to death. But no, that's not a canonical adventure, as Jim Davis himself has commented that it's simply a nightmare. Still, I recommend that you keep it in mind, because after you see today's topic, you'll see that there is a theory that could explain that strange cartoon much better. Garfield, His 9 Lives is a collection of stories that directly connects to the official story, showing us not only that Garfield, like other fictional cats, has 9 lives, but also that everything we know, his personality, tastes, and adventures are only from the 8th. Being a Garfield comic book, of course we have childish things, such as the revelation that he was a space cat in his 9th life, or that he was part of a group of Vikings who were frozen for centuries, only to arrive in the United States in 1984 and discover that his life was better than being an adventurer, or another where 3 cats similar to the 3 Stooges are hired to hunt a mouse, giving birth to his hatred of chasing animals. All of that shows us that these stories do matter, as it's what ends up turning Garfield into Garfield, which makes Lab Animal and Primal Self that much scarier. In Lab Animal, Garfield, or 19GB, as he's known in this life, is a cat locked up and being experimented on in a secret lab, where after being injected with a strange serum he escapes, but is chased by dogs, armed guards, and even helicopters, only for, when he finally seems to have lost them, he transforms into a dog, keeping his memories, but condemned to live as something he is not. We are even told that this was quite a traumatic event, as this is where his hatred for the veterinarian comes from, along with making him vomit every time he is near medical equipment. But although this story shows us how cruel life can be to the cat, there is one that shows us that he can be worse. In Primal Self, we follow a domestic cat named Tigger, who lives with a lonely elderly woman enjoying her company, until one tragic day, an evil force known as his primal instinct enters him, turning him into a wild and uncontrollable version of himself. And when his old woman calls for him, we cut to a grim image of a bristling cat pouncing on the woman, who holds a drawing of her grandson in her hands. It turns out that this was the life that showed him that he doesn't have to let himself become too much of a cat. So before he met Odie, John, love lasagna, and hate Mondays, he had already taken the life of an innocent person. What's interesting is that this isn't the first time this has happened. The idea that Garfield has already died and been reincarnated in different ways has been explored 3 times under the same name. This comic was adapted into an animated special and more recently reinterpreted in a new comic published by publisher Kaboom, each with new lives and deaths for Garfield. The animated special begins in a rather interesting way. with God himself being the one who created the cats, defining several of their characteristics. And there is a segment quite similar to the beginning of the comics, which we mention here because it is a detail that will return later. In the special, there are several lives that are repeated, such as the prehistoric cats, or the third life that is based on the Garden of Eden, of which I reserve my opinions, or even the story of the laboratory cat. But we are interested in a new story. Known as Diana's Piano, it is a story where a woman and her cat grow up together, while little by little they grow apart. And the only thing that brings them closer, even in the last days of Diana's life, was the music played by her owner, dying on the piano to represent their mutual love. And keeping in mind that this is the Funny Cat Show, it is quite out of place. Obviously, we also have other curious lives the feline went through. For example, he was a pharaoh in ancient Egypt. There is one where he was a stunt double who only lived for about 15 seconds, and again we see him as a space cat. However, when we get to the last section, we find something curious. As you can imagine, the only ending a special like this can have is to show us the end of the cat, who, accompanied by Odie, reaches the afterlife, where God is about to take them, but with a bit of ingenuity, Garfield not only convinces him that it wasn't fair to kill him now, taking into account all that he has lived, but also manages to trick him, convincing God that he was just in his first life and that Odie was also a cat. That's right, Garfield cheats death and restarts a new cycle of 9 lives, which presents an interesting concept. At the end of the book from 1984, this doesn't happen, but it's not unreasonable to think that Garfield did something similar on his first arrival in heaven, convincing God to return him back to his first life and resulting in at least 3 distinct cycles of reincarnation. The first would be about the book, the second about the animated special, and finally we have the new Kaboom comics, which coincidentally starts back in prehistory with his first cave cat story, showing us that, should we add up each of these stories, Garfield has died at least 27 times, and in these comics, we are once again faced with the story of Garfield being a laboratory cat. But this time, instead of suffering from the effects of the mysterious serum, he transforms into a horrible monster that kills the scientists. In other words, it is a new cycle, but there are specific differences. In this cycle, Garfield is once again a caveman, a lab cat, and even a space cat. Everything fits together again. So we imagine that he once again got to God and convinced him to give him back his lives. Right? Well, no, because this is where the Halloween story we talked about at the beginning fits in. Garfield is in a place that doesn't look like home. Cold, hungry, and alone. All alone. So lonely that he hallucinates John and Odie at the end of the comic, which suggests to us that all the comics we know were just the hallucinations of the mind of a starving cat left to his own devices. Because it could just be a nightmare, or a living nightmare, with Garfield living out his last moments. Or if we want to take it further, being tormented by cheating God after dying for the last time at the end of his last cycle of reincarnations, which would make this story have real potential to be the ultimate death of our beloved funny cat. It always struck me as odd that Garfield regained popularity thanks to the various scary and disturbing versions that hit the internet in recent years. But the truth is that after what we saw, those ideas aren't so strange anymore, which I think makes this one of the more interesting universes out there. Plus it includes a fat cat who tricked God into reincarnating 27 times in a row, so it's cool. If you want me to keep ruining your childhood by showing you more of the dark secrets of your favorite cartoons, subscribe. Because trust me, there's still a lot more hiding in plain sight, and you won't want to miss it. I liked the video if you liked it, comment if you have any mysterious mystery you would like to see solved, and see you in the next video.